This video is about the 1 to 4 family residential resale contract promulgated by the Texas Real Estate Commission. First, we're going to cover when to use this contract and when to not use this contract. Then we'll begin with some conceptual topics, and as we continue, we'll drill down into some more nuts and bolts topics. So first, the high level, we'll go over why it's important to learn these contracts. Then we'll go over the mindset that you and I must have when we're going through these, and the mindset that people have as they're interacting in a transaction. Next, we'll go into how to actually use the contract, how to make offers and counteroffers. We'll discuss why words matter, and we'll talk about some general information about the contracts. We'll go over an overview of the contracts themselves. Then we'll drill down and go through the entire 9-page contract, one paragraph at a time. As we're doing that, I'll discuss what to put in the blanks from the perspective of the buyer and the seller, and I'll also go over the pre-printed black and white text. Along the way, we'll discuss best practices. Let's get started. When to use this contract and when not to use this contract. So we'll go over the when to use it first. If you're purchasing or selling a residence of 1 to 4 units in Texas, you should use this contract. Meaning if it's a single family home, a duplex, a triplex, or a quadplex, then you should use this. This form is the form that you'll use most often when you're representing buyers or sellers in a traditional real estate transaction. I even recommend investors use these TREC contracts for many reasons that I won't really go into, but if you want to know, just give me a call. You're going to use these contracts if the property is 1 acre or under, even if it's a short sale, if it involves owner financing, if it's a contingency offer, if it's a backup offer, if you're assuming a loan, if it's in wetlands or coastal area, if it's in a homeowners association or not, whether it has the mineral rights or not, whether it has lead-based paint or not, or whether you're even using a reverse mortgage to purchase the home. In all those scenarios, you would still use this contract. The time you would not use the contract is if it is unimproved property, like raw land or vacant land, just a lot. If it's new construction, you wouldn't use this. If it is considered a farm or a ranch, meaning most of the times if it's over 1 acre, then this would not be the best contract to use. You'd actually use the farm and ranch contract. But some other properties that maybe have 2 to 5 acres, there might be some circumstances you would use the 1 to 4 family residential resale contract, but for the most part, if it's over 1 acre, you wouldn't use this. You would not use this contract if it is a condominium, if it is over 4 units, or if it's a commercial property. Now let's discuss the importance of learning these contracts. You must be intimately familiar with this contract. In many ways, this is your business. All we do is help people come to an agreement to purchase and sell real estate. This contract is the agreement. Expect for your client to read this contract. And if your client reads this contract and asks you questions and it becomes clear that you don't know what you're talking about, the client will begin to view you as an obstacle or as useless. You'll turn into an order taker or a paper pusher. This is the area you're supposed to be an expert, so be an expert. Take this training serious. Learn this contract inside and out. You must know more than your client. As a general rule of thumb, whether it's this contract or another contract, you should always, at a minimum, carefully and slowly read through each line of the contract before you get into any transaction involving any document. And so this is what you're going to get out of the training. If you learn these contracts and you become very knowledgeable and an expert in this area, then you're going to feel more confident, which is going to make you happier. Your negotiating skills are going to improve. You'll be looked at as more of an expert. And inside the transaction, you will gain authority, which will cause the other agent and the parties involved to just comply. They'll understand that you know what you're talking about. And they're just going to follow behind you. Clients will trust you more, and it'll lead to less headaches. And clients will refer you more business. The trust will leverage into more business for you, and you're going to end up making more money. So it's not a magical process. It's just what happens when you become an expert. Now, I want to discuss my mindset as I enter into a transaction and as I'm learning about these contracts and working with the contracts, and the mindset of everybody else involved. So my focus is first and foremost to serve my client's best interest, and usually I'm hoping that means that they're interested in reaching an agreement. So my focus really is serving my client's best interest and reaching an agreement. It's important to aim for a win-win agreement because the contracts aren't the end-all solution. The contracts are only as good as the people writing them. They don't work if the parties involved decide not to follow through on what's been agreed upon. If someone doesn't feel like they're in a fair agreement, they may decide not to follow through. So that's why when a conflict occurs, I focus on coming to an agreeable conclusion, and I try not to focus on who's right or wrong. When the focus becomes who's right or wrong, the objective changes from getting something accomplished and coming to an agreement, and it changes into who's going to win the debate or win the fight. And if it's escalated, fighting really costs a lot of time and money. If we end up in a courtroom, I promise you, the only people that'll be winning are the attorneys. It's important to know who's actually right or wrong so that we can have a better perspective on how to reach an agreeable conclusion. Who or what is actually wrong isn't always as relevant as what the other person thinks is right or wrong, because at times it can be counterproductive to try and convince someone else that they're actually wrong regarding a specific issue. So if we know these contracts inside and out, we can accomplish more, avoid conflicts, and because we'll have the ability to be more deliberate in our actions and communicate with greater clarity, we will actually close more deals. And with greater ease. It'll just have a better result all around. Again, we learn this stuff so we can be experts, serve our clients well. Most people just want a fair shake and expect for each other to do as we've agreed. Putting all this stuff in writing provides specific and accurate communication, so everybody's on the same page and we all work towards the same conclusion. Our goal is not to take these contracts into court, but it's just so everybody can understand what we've agreed on. Let's go over how to use the contracts. The first step is usually just for the buyer to write an offer. So what is an offer? An offer is made by simply filling out the contract to fit the terms you would agree to, and then you send that contract over to the seller. So after the buyer's done that, they send it over to the seller. If the seller likes what the buyer proposed, then the seller can just initial and sign the contract, and then we'll have an agreement. Now, if the seller isn't happy with the terms proposed by the buyer, for instance, if the buyer proposed, say, a $300,000 purchase price, but the seller didn't like $300,000, the seller wants $310,000, then the seller can make a counteroffer. This is done by striking through the terms that they don't agree to and then writing in the new terms that they would like to propose. So in this case, the seller would draw one line through $300,000, and right beside it they would write $310,000, and then the seller would just initial any changes made. And then send that contract, the altered contract, back over to the buyer. So now the seller's initialed and signed everything. They've initialed the changes, and so then next, if the buyer agrees to the changes that the seller's proposing, then the buyer will just initial those changes. Then we'll have an agreement, and we'll move on. If it doesn't happen like that, then this just continues. We just keep going back and forth until it becomes clear that the two parties won't reach an agreement or until an agreement is made. Just a note, it is acceptable to respond to an offer or counteroffer verbally to help expedite the negotiations. Just realize that the verbally negotiated terms can't be enforced until they are reduced to writing and agreed upon, signed, initialed, and the contract is executed. Before you make a verbal offer, keep in mind how that will serve your strategy. Sometimes speed is very important, so verbal offers are a good idea, but presenting a counteroffer in writing can convey a message that might be taken more seriously. So just do whatever's best for your situation and your strategy. Also, don't be surprised if you verbally agree on something and then the seller decides to take another higher offer. Keep in mind, verbal negotiations, they just can't be enforced. Next, let's talk about why words matter. So this is interesting to me. A contract, all it is just a bunch of words that put together form ideas, and those words have definitions. And so the meaning of these words matters a lot. And that's what attorneys get paid the big bucks, because they are masterful at using words and they understand the fullness and maybe even a deeper meaning of the words that we're using. So just carefully consider the definition of the words on the contract and what the words really mean. So real quick, I want to define just a few words for you before we get into this too deep. The word shall is a word that you're going to see a lot, and you can just substitute the word must for the word shall, if that helps you better understand the sentence. Something else that you're going to hear me talk about and see in the contract is the word addendum and the word amendment. I want to talk about the differences between these. Both of these documents are used to change the terms of the agreement. The real difference comes in, the real difference between them is when those documents are used. An addendum is used at the same time you're coming to agreement in this main contract, this 1 to 4 family residential resale contract. Sometimes you'll have an addendum or two that will accompany it, and you'll sign those at the same exact time you're signing the main contract. An amendment would come into play later. Let's say you've agreed to everything. You've signed contracts and addendums and everything. You've got a solid agreement. Well, if the buyer and seller decide to change the terms of the contract after the fact, they would fill out an amendment. So some circumstances where you might amend the contract would be if you were changing, for instance, a deadline or trying to negotiate repairs. Also, I want to just go over what the word promulgated means. Promulgated, in short, it just means to publish or to make widely known or to put into effect and make up official proclamations. So when we say that this is the Texas Real Estate Commission promulgated contract, then it's just Texas Real Estate Commission is the one that's putting it out there, basically. Now let's start talking about the contracts themselves. I want to go over a little bit of an overview of these documents. So these documents were drafted to clarify common issues, and they're drafted to be fair so as not to favor the buyer or the seller. It's really what you put in the blanks that gives one party an advantage over the other, potentially. The contracts are also updated once in a while, and you just want to make sure that you have the most recent copy of the contracts. The Board of Realtors can actually fine real estate agents or realtors if we're using an outdated form. So if you're a realtor and someone sends you an offer on an outdated form, all you have to do is just politely ask them to redo it on one of the most recent forms, and it's really not that big of a deal. Also, if there's a TREC promulgated form for a specific area or specific purpose, then you want to use that form. We're actually required to use the TREC promulgated forms unless our client insists on us using something different. For instance, let me just give you an example. Let's say you wanted to include some personal property in the sale, in the transaction of the real estate transaction. So let's say the buyer wanted to keep the seller's refrigerator. Well, then you wouldn't write seller or buyer retains refrigerator or buyer refrigerator shall convey at closing. You wouldn't write that in the special provisions. You'd actually get the personal property addendum that's promulgated by TREC to notate that. It's also a good idea to take a picture of it so that you can make sure that you're actually going to get what you want. If you said, I want to keep a patio chair and there's 3 or 4 patio chairs, then you'll just want to make sure you're actually getting the one that you're most interested in. Also, if another document is used, let's say your client insists on some other kind of document being used, you likely won't have the authority to even assist them or answer too many questions or help fill out the contracts, just because the authority given to you through your license, it just doesn't give you the ability to help out with any other contracts. You haven't had adequate training for those contracts, and doing so may be considered practicing law without a license, and doing that could get your license revoked. In the contract, all timelines and deadlines are meant to include all calendar days, not just business days, and it even counts weekends and holidays. So if you got a 5-day deadline and that 5 days straddles a weekend and a holiday, the weekend and holiday still counts against your 5 days. The entire contract is a total of 9 pages. The first 8 pages are the agreement between the buyer and the seller, and the 9th page is for receipts, and it's to notate which brokers are involved in the transaction. The first 7 pages have initials at the bottom of the page, and then pages 2 through 8 has an address field at the top. So you want to make sure that your clients are initialing every blank and you're filling in the address blank at the top of each page. Filling out the address helps to identify the page in case the page is misplaced. And one final note on how to fill out the contracts. Unless you have a reason to deliberately leave a field in the contract blank, and putting some kind of text in the field is a great way to avoid making errors, even if the text is just NA, which is the abbreviation for not applicable. This also lets other people in the transaction know that you have seen that field, you didn't skip over it, you've given it careful consideration, and it wasn't unintentionally left blank. So, all right, that's it for the introduction and all of the background and overview and everything. Let's go ahead and dig into the next part, which is the nuts and bolts. We're going over the contract one paragraph at a time. Hey, I just want to take a quick second to say thank you for watching this video. I really appreciate it. All the likes and the comments and the views. It was just been amazing how useful people have seen this video to be. So I just want to thank you. This video is the same exact video as the one I've uploaded before. The only difference is that TREC came in and did a whole lot of contract changes to this contract, changed a bunch of wording and some different paragraphs, and they made that all effective November 2nd, 2015. And so the contract you're listening to now, or the recording you're listening to now, is going to include all the new major changes. So you're going to have a change that happened in paragraph 23 where they added a 5 o'clock deadline to the option period. You're going to have a change in where the damages are. If you wanted to take somebody to court because they didn't sign a release, where they eliminated the penalty that says you have to pay 3 times the damages. And paragraph 3 on the front page, they eliminated, they eliminated paragraph 4 and they revised paragraph 3. Anyway, if you go to all these paragraphs, you'll find, if you just look at the new TREC contract, you're going to see the TREC contract in the current form. And in this video, you're going to find all those major changes. The thing that I don't go into in this contract and that I did not revise are all the insignificant changes, the things that nobody gives a crap about. There are things like they changed the word licensee to now it's license holder. Nobody cares about that. I wasn't going to go back through and revise everywhere where it said licensee or license holder. The other thing is at the bottom of every page, you'll notice that there is a TREC form number. It says TREC number 2013. Well, it used to say TREC number 2012. I'm not going in to change that one. I'm so sorry. At the top of the page, they have the date, which is the effective date of the contract. That is a great thing to pay attention to in real life when you receive a contract or you're about to write a contract. If you notice that the most current revision of the contract isn't being used, then that is a no-no, and it's required of all real estate agents to use the most updated form. So you want to make sure that it now says November 2nd, 2015. If you go through this recording, you're going to see plenty of places where you see the old date, and just don't let that throw you off. Every bit of the writing in this entire contract, I would say 99% of it stayed exactly the same. Just some few key paragraphs had some changes, and I did revise those in the video here. So a couple other little minor things. I mean, we're talking stupid things that you just don't care about. So there you have it. Enjoy. Please give me your comments, like, subscribe, everything. I absolutely eat it up, and I really appreciate it. Y'all have a great day. Enjoy the video. Paragraph 1, the parties. The simplicity of this paragraph leads to mistakes. This section introduces you to the parties of the contract, the seller and the buyer. You are not a party to the contract. You're just an agent. We're licensees. We're not an attorney. Our client can do just about anything that they want to do, even if it doesn't serve their best interest. And by the way, it's not up to us to determine what their best interest is. It's up to them to determine their best interest. So just an example is if the buyer insists on talking to the seller, if the buyer and the seller are complicit in that, they're okay with it, then by all means the agents should step out of the way and let the buyer and the seller talk. As much as that gives me the EBGBs, if they feel like that's in their best interest, then they have full authority to do that. In the first blank you put the seller's name, second blank you put the buyer's name. Use the correct spelling of the legal name of each party. No nicknames, no middle, don't use the middle name as the first name, if they happen to go by their middle name. Put their full legal name, no abbreviations, and find out if they're a junior or a third, or if there's some kind of suffix or prefix you need to include in there. The easiest way to do this is just to ask your client to spell their full legal name for you. And also, the way I write it, I like to write their full names out. I don't like to write Tracy and John Smith. I like to write Tracy Smith and John Smith as a purchaser. I don't know if there's any kind of legal reason for that. I don't know why. I just feel like that's the complete way to do it. So that's the way our company does it. And this is an opportunity for you to head off problems in advance. This gives you an opportunity to verify their driver's license to make sure that their name matches, and that could help you avoid a potential conflict with the notary at closing, because if the driver's license doesn't match the contract and doesn't match the lender documents, you could have a problem, which brings me to the lender documents. This gives you an opportunity to verify how their name appears on the loan documents to ensure that you're not going to have to file an amendment to reconcile the differences between the contract and the loan documents. If the name appears different on each, then you're going to have to amend the contract. Also, don't leave the seller's name blank. If you're the representing the buyer making the offer and you don't know what the seller's name is, try your hardest not to leave it blank. Do everything you can. Look at the bottom of the MLS listing to see if you can find the seller's name there. If you can't find it there, then look at the Central Appraisal District website if you can. And if you need help finding the Central Appraisal District website, just Google CAD and the county name. So for instance, Tarrant CAD or whatever. And then also, it would be a great idea just to call the agent and ask them what the seller's name is, and include that question in just your normal standard pre-offer phone call that you should probably be making anyway. One other note here is if there's any kind of question as to how the title should be vested, or the kind of legal structure between multiple parties on the contract, then you might need to specify. So for instance, if you've got two people on the contract, but they're not married, but they're like buying it both as purchasers, then you might need to say something like, I don't know, it'd be kind of weird, I guess, but John Smith, a single man, and Jane Doe, a single woman, or right, that they're tenants in common, or certainly if it's a company, then you'd want to put the legal structure of the company. So if it's a corporation or an LLC, make sure and include that. If you're the listing agent, then this is a good opportunity for you to just verify and make sure that there isn't anything weird going on with the ownership. If the husband and wife are not talking to each other, sending you mixed signals, you might want to just check and see if they filed for divorce or something. I don't know how you have that conversation, but just find out if there's anything weird going on with the ownership, any deaths that have happened, if you're selling it out of an estate, anything that could fracture the ownership somehow. If there's multiple buyers or sellers and for some reason they won't be able to be present at the same time for closing, then find out now so you can start working on getting a power of attorney together. And because sometimes it takes a little time to get the power of attorney approved by the title company or the buyer's lender. So it's good to find out about that ahead of time. And a side note, just for the investors, if you want to put something like and or assigns, you think you might assign the contract, there's really no need to put and or assigns on the contract. All contracts are going to be assignable unless they specifically say that they're not assignable. But I don't believe our company is going to be dealing with any contract assigning anytime soon. So I guess that's just a bonus little point. Okay, paragraph 2. This is the property. This is the item that the buyer is agreeing to purchase and the seller is agreeing to sell. Paragraph A here, A of property, you've got the land. B is improvements, C is accessories, D is exclusions. And so diving into A here, the land, we've got the legal description and then what the property is known as. So legal description, you'll see that described in one of two different ways. In this contract, it lines out the lot and block legal description of the property. Another way that it could be described is using meets and bounds. You're typically not going to see meets and bounds unless it's an older house or includes some acreage, in which case you might use an unimproved property contract or maybe farm and ranch contract. So most of the time it's going to be lot and block. If you were to run out of room and you didn't have enough room to write the entire legal description, you can use the special provisions to continue the legal description there or an attached sheet of paper. I would actually probably just prefer an attached sheet of paper. Let's see, the improvement section. These are generally things that are permanently installed or built into the house itself. So it includes window screens, shutters, awnings, carpet, mirrors, ceiling fans, mailboxes, TV antennas, the mounts and brackets used to hang flat screen TVs on, speakers, so the surround sound speakers, air conditioning units, smoke detectors, wiring, plumbing, on and on. Garage door openers, shrubbery, landscaping, outdoor cooking equipment, and that sort of thing. So these are things that are actually attached to the property. C is the section for accessories. These are items that are not permanently installed or attached, but they still convey, they're still part of the legal agreement here, and it includes things such as the curtains and rods, fireplace screens, blinds, window shades, draperies, rods, door keys, mailbox keys, above ground swimming pool keys, maintenance accessories, and that sort of thing. So D in the exclusions blank, this is where you would write something that is either an improvement or an accessory, either a B or a C here, that is not going to be conveyed with the sale of the property. So let me just read this. The following improvements or accessories will be retained by the seller and must be removed prior to delivery of possession. So one thing that you can't really do, that this paragraph is not intended to do, is for the seller to retain their mineral rights in this section here. So and there's a couple reasons why. Number one is mineral rights are neither an improvement or an accessory, and you can't really, the seller can't really remove them prior to possession. So the function of the paragraph just clearly doesn't work with mineral rights. Another reason why is because TREC promulgated an addendum specifically to allow the seller to retain the mineral rights. And so whenever TREC does that, unless a party to the contract specifically mandates that we don't use those, then we need to use that addendum that's specifically for that purpose. Another thing to do here, if you're a buyer's agent, you need to look on the MLS to see if they've noted ahead of time that there are any exclusions that they want to note in the contract and don't want included in the sale. If there are, then you'd want to list those out here. So items that would be great to list that you commonly see are items such as rose bushes. I've had several clients want to keep their rose bushes. Surround sound speakers, the curtains and draperies, the window treatments, that sort of thing. Those are items that you would include in the exclusions if the seller wanted to retain them. Let's talk about paragraph 3. Paragraph 3 is one of those paragraphs that was revised when TREC redid all the forms and they became effective November 2nd, 2015. And so what they did is they took what was the old paragraph 4 and they combined it with what paragraph 3 was. And so now we have a new paragraph 3. Paragraph 3 describes the sales price. And it also begins to describe the kind of financing that's going to be used to purchase the property. So the way that it works here is line C is the total sales price. That's going to be the number that the seller cares the most about, because that's the amount of money, that's the total purchase price. That's the amount of money that the seller is going to actually receive. What this contract does is it divides it up so that the first line here, line A, that's going to be the down payment amount. Line B is going to be the amount financed, the loan amount, and then you just total those together to get line C. So in A plus B is always going to equal C no matter what. So if you've got a deal where there's no down payment at all, zero down payment, then in line A for the cash portion of the sales price, there's no down payment, so there's no cash. So you would put 0 on that first blank there on line A. Line B would be the total financed amount. Well, if there's 0 down payment, that means the entire amount of the sales price has to be financed. Let's say it's a $100,000 sales price. That means that $100,000 is going to have to get financed, so $100,000 goes in line B. Line C will be the total sales price. In this case, it's going to be $100,000 because 0 was the down payment, $100,000 was the financed amount in line B, and then so line C is $100,000. Same thing would happen if it was a cash deal, only it would be reversed. So if no financing was taking place, if the buyer was using just total cash to buy the house, then all of the entire sales price would be in cash form. So in that same example, $100,000 would go in line A. There would be no financed amount, so line B would be blank, or you'd put a 0 in there, and then line C would be $100,000. Okay, all that stuff is the same as it used to be. The only thing that's really different here on paragraph 3 is on line B, where it's talking about the financing. You have 3 different options. This gives you the option to select the type of financing that's going to be used, and it references an addendum that's going to correspond with that type of financing that you need to attach to the contract that describes that type of financing in detail. So the one that you're going to use the most of, and it's going to happen on almost any transaction that it contains financing, like a mortgage, you'll have to check this box that says third-party financing addendum. Okay, now TREC did go in and totally revise the third-party financing addendum, and basically what they did is they took all the language that was in paragraph 4 before they revised this TREC contract, and then they just added that to the third-party financing addendum, and they took out the reverse mortgage stuff out of that third-party financing addendum. But we're going to get into detail on that third-party financing addendum in a different video. For the purposes of this, all you're going to need to do is just make sure you understand third-party financing means any type of financing that is from a bank or from a third party, if it's from mom and dad, if you're getting a loan from mom and dad, if you're getting a loan from Joe Bob at church and he's got a bunch of money and he wants to lend it to you so you can buy a house, or if you're going to Wells Fargo or Bank of America or one of those typical conventional regular lenders, then you're going to check third-party financing and make sure that third-party financing addendum is filled out completely. One last word on this paragraph is that if something happens in the course of the transaction where you go and have to amend or you negotiate the purchase price, that's done fairly often. And so if you change the purchase price and amend that in the contract, and the buyer's using some financing, make sure that you also amend the financed amount, okay? It's because what's going to happen is there are certain protections that the buyer is given that are spelled out in that third-party financing addendum, and if you don't amend the financed amount to make sure that matches up with the third-party financing addendum and to reflect the new changes of whatever the negotiated new changes are, then you may lose some of your protection there that third-party financing addendum offers. So that is it for paragraph 3. I'm going to move on to paragraph 4. Paragraph 4, this is where you disclose if you have a real estate license and you're buying the property, or you have a real estate license and you're selling the property yourself, like you're going to be the buyer or you are yourself the seller, and if you have that real estate license, you must disclose that. And that's what this paragraph is for. It gives you the space available to disclose that you're a license holder. It also is where you would disclose if you have some kind of close relationship with the buyer or seller. And then it spells out all the different types of relationships that you might have in different scenarios where you would need to disclose that you are a license holder and you have some kind of relation. So it goes into whether if the buyer or seller is your spouse, if they're your parent, your child, on, and it goes into detail here. So this is where you would disclose that you have a real estate license, plain and simple. Paragraph 5, earnest money. Earnest money is a deposit made up front by the buyer to indicate that they're serious about the offer or the contract. And this amount, it can be anything that the client's comfortable paying. I always advise my client that the seller is most likely expecting the amount of the earnest money to be equivalent to about 1% of the purchase price, and that's usually rounded to the nearest $250 increment. There are exceptions to this. Super low-end properties and high-end properties, they tend to break the mold here a little bit. And builder deals tend to be much higher because the builder's putting a lot more at risk, so they're going to expect a little bit more earnest money, expect the buyer to risk a little bit more. So I explained when this earnest money is put at risk to my client exactly when it is put at risk, and then I explained that if my client wants to convey a stronger commitment and make a stronger offer, then I suggest that they make a deposit that's more than 1%. There's no limit. As long as they understand the risk that's involved, I don't care how much they put down, whatever they feel like they need to put down to convey their level of seriousness. Now, if they don't care at all about the house, really, and they just want to get it, if they are able to get it at a super low price, then they're free to put down as little as they want as well. And in fact, earnest money isn't even required. They could put $0 down. And if you represent the seller, I always present the offer to your client, even if there is no earnest money, unless your client has instructed you not to present offers in a circumstance like that. Line 5 is also where you're going to put the title company information. In the first blank, you're going to put the actual escrow agent that you're going to use, and the second blank, you're going to put the actual title company that you're using. And make sure to actually put the address, or at least the city name, because a lot of times these title companies have multiple locations, and I've had a deal end up at the wrong title company. I ended up using a title company I wasn't really familiar with, which wasn't the end of the world, but it helps just specify that. Now, the earnest money is a deposit. It's a buyer obligation, and it's a performance obligation for the buyer. And it's only supposed to be deposited after the contract is effective. So like most performance obligations in the contract, time is not of the essence, which is kind of weird to me, but that's the way it is. Therefore, the buyer has a reasonable amount of time after the contract is executed to deposit the earnest money. The quote reasonable time depends on the circumstances, and it could be decided in court if there was a dispute over it. Now, that's if the buyer's going to deposit it, which I'm usually collecting the earnest money up front from my client when we make the offer, so that I have control of that and I can make sure it gets delivered. Well, earnest money that's received by the broker must be delivered to the authorized escrow agent within a reasonable amount of time, and the Real Estate Commission has determined that a reasonable amount of time in this circumstance to be not later than the close of business on the second working day after the date that the broker receives the money. Now let's talk about the last two blanks here. It says the buyer shall deposit additional earnest money within X amount of days. That's a section that I've seen a builder utilize, although the builder would normally use a different contract. But that would be a circumstance where if the builder entered a new phase of construction, then they wanted additional earnest money. That could be utilized there. I've actually seen people put NA in the first two blanks, and then actually put their earnest money amount and a certain number of days that's actually equivalent to the option period days in the second blank. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to utilize, I guess, kind of a tactic to withhold the earnest money and not deposit it until the end of the option period, which is just kind of weird. I don't think there's anything illegal about it or anything. Our company doesn't do that though, but I've seen that happen. So most of the time those last two blanks are going to have an NA in them. Paragraph 6, title policy and survey. This paragraph begins on page 2 and it doesn't end until page 4. It's pretty lengthy. There are 5 sections in this paragraph. Section A is the title policy, B is the commitment, C is the survey, D are objections, and E is the title notices section. So let me just describe what a title policy is real quick. It's actually would be more accurately called a title insurance policy, since that's what it really is. This is insurance that protects the homeowner and the lender against financial losses from defects in the title. It ensures that you're actually buying the property that you think you're buying. It's so that the money that you're paying, so that you'll know that that money is actually going toward ownership, and that the seller actually had the right to sell the property, and they're actually selling the entire property. And so it really just ensures that the homework that the title company did in researching the chain of ownership was good, accurate homework, and there wasn't something that they missed. If there was something that they missed, or somebody files a lawsuit staking claim to the property, then that's where the title insurance would come into play. But just like any, quote, good insurance, there's going to be exceptions to the coverage. Just like the old style of health insurance, there are pre-existing conditions that aren't going to be covered, and there are certain things that might be considered maybe too risky that aren't going to be covered, and things that just don't make sense that aren't going to be covered. And so that's what numbers 1 through 8 here go into detail on, are the exceptions. So let's just back up for just a second and talk about the practical application of this paragraph a little bit more. Okay, first line, it says that the seller shall furnish to the buyer at the seller or the buyer's expense one of these policies. The seller is usually who is negotiated to pay for the title policy in most traditional transactions, but the buyer certainly can. The title policy cost is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of about 1%, and I'm sure if somebody from a title company is listening, they would probably just kind of cringe at the thought of me saying that, because that is actually a pretty horrible estimation. It gives you some kind of general ballpark, but the best way to find out the actual cost of the insurance is to go to the title company's website that's issuing the insurance, and they usually have an automated calculator where you can go in and plug in your numbers and determine the actual cost of the title policy that you're going to get. It's the best way to do it. It's what we do for all of our sellers. And then so here's this next blank. This is for you to put in who the title company actually is. You're probably going to use the same exact title company that you use in the Earnest Money blank. I haven't ever seen an exception to that, but so you're going to use the same title policy. That company is issuing the title policy, and usually the seller is going to pay for it. So let's skip down to number 8 here and talk about one of the exceptions, one thing that isn't covered in the title policy, and go into detail about some of the options you have for this paragraph. Before I go into number 8 too much, I need to talk about what a survey actually is. A survey is a sketch of the property lines and boundaries and of the easements on a property. It shows how much property the purchaser is buying. And so normally errors on the survey are not insured by the title policy because of it's an exception to the coverage. So number 8 allows you to insure against errors on the survey. So where this would come into play is if you're not actually ordering a survey. If you're using an existing survey, then the surveyor who drew that survey, they owe you no obligation because you weren't their client. You didn't pay them. Whoever paid that surveyor was guaranteed a certain quality of work by the surveyor. And so if there was an error, that surveyor would probably cover it. He probably had at least errors and omissions insurance or something that would cover any errors made on that survey. So if you're not getting a new survey, then it's really a good idea to go ahead and get this coverage. If you are getting a new survey, then you are going to be that surveyor's client, and so there are going to be extra protections in place. And so there may not be as strong of a reason to get the insurance here. So you can either amend the exception to say that it would cover shortages in area. In other words, if the surveyor drew the line a little too far in and it shorted the homeowner of land that the homeowner really wanted, then it would cover an error like that. And then you can say that the buyer or the seller pays for that insurance. Either way, it doesn't matter. The cost of the insurance is going to be anywhere from 5% to 10% of the cost of the insurance policy, the title insurance policy. So just for instance, if the title insurance policy is about 1%, then the cost of this is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 5% of 1% of the title policy. It's really not much money. It's a good idea to get if you're using an existing survey. All right, section B here is the commitment. What this really is the title insurance company's commitment to insure the property under certain, or insure the title under certain conditions. And since they can't actually provide the insurance until they get paid, the insurance doesn't kick in until closing, but this is their commitment to insure it. And so the title commitment is a document it's several documents that shows everybody under what conditions they're willing to insure the title. And the conditions are their covenants, meaning their promises to insure it, or their conditions or restrictions that are going to limit their coverage. And they have to deliver that bundle of paper to the buyer within 20 days of receiving the executed contract. Okay, and the place that they're going to deliver that bundle of paper is going to be to the address, the contact information that we're going to list in paragraph 21, which is where we're going to list the purchaser's contact information for all the notices to be sent. So if the title company doesn't send it in time, then they've got all sorts of little ways that they can extend it. They can extend it up to 15 days or 3 days before closing. And if something happens and for whatever reason they're just not able to issue a commitment and nobody's really preventing them from doing so, then the buyer will have the option to terminate the contract and earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. I've seen it happen on like foreclosure type deals where there was some kind of weird ownership chain there, but I haven't ever seen that a deal not go through on just a traditional sale. Section C, the survey. Okay, this is actually a pretty interesting section here, and I'm going to just nerd out on it a little bit. First, let's hit up the easy sections first, the easy options. You've got 3 different options to choose from. Option 3 says that the seller's going to pay for a new survey. Option 2 says the buyer's going to pay for a new survey. And then you've got to select how many days they have to deliver the survey. The title company is almost always going to be the one to actually order the survey. And the box that you check here, either 2 or 3, that's going to depend on whose side of the settlement statement the fee ends up on. So I just want to make sure that the survey is not ordered prematurely. The survey is going to take maybe about 5 days to complete. You want to make sure you get it at least 5 to 7 days before the closing date. But you want to make sure that you're not ordering it inside the option period, because if the deal falls apart, you don't want to have that extra expense hanging around. So you just pick your date there according to those parameters. Okay, so let's just go back up at the top, and I'm just going to read through this and kind of nerd out on it. Okay. The survey must be made by a registered professional land surveyor, no problem, acceptable to the title company and the buyer's lender. Okay. So it's got to be acceptable to the title company and buyer's lender. All right. Let's say that we're checking box number 1. Within blank days after the effective date of this contract, the seller shall furnish to buyer and the title company the seller's existing survey of the property and a residential real property affidavit promulgated by the Texas Department of Insurance. Okay, so you got a lot of things that are already happening here. Within a certain amount of days, I'm going to always put that amount of days to be at least the first portion of my option period. So maybe if I've got a 7-day option period, I might put a deadline of 3 days in there. And I'll typically ask for the survey right up front in my pre-offer phone call that I make to the listing agent. So a lot of times I'll just have that in my possession already. But there you go. So the seller shall furnish it to the buyer and the title company. So if the seller doesn't furnish it to the buyer and the title company, they haven't completed their obligation here, and they've got to submit the survey and the T47 affidavit, and it's a specific T47 affidavit. I think if you Google T47 affidavit, you're probably going to be okay. You're probably going to find the one from the Texas Department of Insurance, but just to make sure, go ahead and just Google Texas Department of Insurance T47 affidavit. All right, so you got to deliver both those instruments to both those people. If the seller fails to furnish the existing survey or affidavit within time prescribed, buyer shall obtain a new survey at the seller's expense, no later than 3 days prior to closing. So if they don't do it, then the seller's paying for this thing. Okay? If the existing survey or affidavit is not acceptable to the title company or the lender, then the buyer shall obtain a new survey. Here's your option, at the seller or buyer's expense. Oftentimes, I see buyers selecting that the buyer would pay for it if it's not acceptable. And I think that's kind of a mistake, because on that T47 form, it doesn't say that there haven't been any changes made since the survey was drawn. It's just an affidavit guaranteeing or allowing the seller the ability to either say that there weren't any changes or to list whatever changes were made since the survey was drawn. So let's just say a pool was installed since the survey was drawn, okay? And the seller knows full well that a pool was drawn and that survey is probably not any good. Now, morals aside, that's a totally different issue that we probably should discuss if we're involved in the transaction. But morals aside, let's say that seller says, all right, the buyer is asking for my existing survey, and they're saying that the buyer is going to pay for it if it's not acceptable. So the seller might take that T47 form and write in that no changes have been made to the property except the swimming pool is put in. Well, if the seller delivers that survey in the T47 to the buyer and the title company within the time prescribed, they've upheld their obligation. Well, there's a good chance that in that scenario, the lender is going to require a new survey to be drawn. And if that happens, then all of a sudden the buyer is going to be the one having to cough up the money for that survey. So it's just kind of sticky. There's a lot of moving parts there. I just wanted to kind of go into detail about it and explain the risks. If I'm ever a buyer making an offer, if I'm selecting option 1, first of all, I'm gonna get the extra coverage that reads shortages in area, and then I'm gonna say if it's not acceptable, the seller's paying for it, and that's probably the way I'm gonna style my offer if my client is just open to whatever. So there you go. Moving on. Section D, objections. All right, if the title commitment reveals that there's a problem with the title, some kind of defect or encumbrance to the title, then you can object to it here. You can also object to certain activities that you find out are prohibited. Or let's say you just want to ensure that a certain activity is allowed at the property, then you would put that activity here so that if it is disallowed or not allowed, then you have a way to, you're voicing your objection to that. So some examples here. Well, let me tell you what an example is not. An example is not single family residential or SFR. That's not what should be put in this blank. If you cannot live in the house, if the house is not, it just doesn't make any sense. It's single family residential real estate contract. There's a house there. Obviously, the real estate is allowed, and you don't have to put that the home has to be allowed there. It just doesn't make sense. That's not the intention of this paragraph. The intention here is if you wanted to have like an exotic pet, for instance, like a pet pig inside the city limits. I know there was a instance of that in Keller at some point. There was so a lady wanted to have a pig as a pet pig. She just moved to town, and Keller had a ordinance at the time, probably still do, where they don't allow swine in city limits. So that would be something that you would put there. If your folks, if the buyers wanted to install a swimming pool at some point, they might want to put that a swimming pool would be allowed to be installed on the property, so that if they find out later that it is not allowed, then they can object to that. If they want to install a carport or any kind of buildings, or if they wanted to have some kind of business use in the house, like for instance an in-home daycare, then those are things that you would put in this blank. Way to find out what your client is planning to do to the property, if there's something you should be putting in this blank, is you just simply ask them, hey, what are you planning to do with the property? What are your plans here? And just they'll tell you. So that's it. All right, moving on. This is one area where I strategically leave a blank empty, and it's for this little timeline here. It says that the buyer must object the earlier of the closing date or blank days after the buyer receives the commitment. So and then it says the earlier of the closing date or blank days after the buyer receives the commitment. Well, if I'm representing the buyer, I don't want to put any additional constraints on my client, just acting on their best interest. I want to give them as much time as possible. So I feel like it's to my client's advantage to not put anything in the blank that might shorten that timeline. If I'm the seller, then I'd probably want a certain number of days in there, but I've just never seen this be a big issue. If there was an activity that was mentioned, then it might become more of an issue. But so I would strategically leave that blank and move on. Section E, title notices. This is the last section inside paragraph 6, and there are 9 subsections inside this section. All right. wonder if I could say section again. All right, so we've got section E is title notices. The word notices is a very specific word, and it carries a unique meaning in the confines of this contract. And it relates to paragraph 21. Paragraph 21 is the designated location that all the notices are supposed to be delivered to. And the notices carry certain meaning. I don't want to get into trying to define what constitutes a notice, but in the contract, if it says a notice, just realize that is a specific thing that must be delivered to that whatever location it mentions in paragraph 21. All right, so let's go number 1, abstract or title policy. This is something I learned about in real estate school. As a licensee, I'm supposed to recommend to every client that they get a abstract or a title search or a title policy. And if I don't, then I get in big trouble. Well, thank goodness TREC just made it as standard print in their contract here. If you're not using a TREC contract, though, you need to make sure that you're recommending that your client get a title policy. Okay. Section 2, membership in a homeowners association. It either is or is not subject to mandatory membership in a homeowners association, HOA. If it is, you need to include the homeowners association addendum to accompany this contract. One thing that it mentions in here is that if the house is in an HOA and you don't pay your dues, then the homeowners association could put a lien on the property and even possibly foreclose at some point. Next is a statutory tax district. This is basically just an area that they've kind of cordoned off and decided that they are going to tax uniquely. It's just a political area or an area that they've decided that is a special area that they're going to tax uniquely. Maybe there were certain services that were offered to this area, and so now there's a special tax rate or a certain bond or indebtedness that they're going to have that the area is concerned with. Anyway, you're going to get a notice if you're in one of those areas. Number 4, tidewaters. This really just has to do with coastal properties, oceanfront properties. Number 5, annexation. This is if the property is in the ETJ or the extraterritorial jurisdiction area outside of the city limits of a town, and it's likely to be swallowed up by the town. This is just serving notice that area could be annexed at some point. Maybe you'd have certain taxes that would be due if it is annexed. And so just kind of be aware if you're in one of those areas in the urban sprawl situation, then you could get some extra taxes at some point if you're swallowed up. All right. Number 6, property located in a certified service area of a utility service provider. Okay. This is maybe if you're in a rural area and the utilities haven't quite reached you, and yet the utility companies need to go ahead and plumb those areas, then they could install water lines and sewer lines and really tear up your property and maybe cost you some damages or cost you some fees to maybe access your property or something. I'm not really sure, but if you're affected by that, you're going to get a notice. Number 7 is a public improvement district. I'm actually currently sitting adjacent to a public improvement district in North Fort Worth area. There's a subdivision called the Heritage Subdivision that is a public improvement district. This is basically an area that is offered additional services by the city, and so the city actually maintains certain common areas like parks and that sort of thing, provides extra services to the community, and so they're charged a little bit of an extra tax. And so if you're in one of those areas, you're going to be made aware of the additional tax that you're being charged, and you'll get a notice for that. Number 8 is Heritage is a very nice area, by the way, and so whatever public improvement is going on there is paying off because it's a really nice area. All right, number 8, transfer fees. This is something that developers were doing, and it was all the rage a while back, and I think some laws were passed, and this has kind of calmed down some, but maybe there are some areas that still have private transfer fees. But it was stuff that was a fee that was imposed by the developer. It said if you sell your property, then you've got to pay the developer a fee every time it sells, no matter what. And so if you're in one of those areas, you're going to get a notice. It's kind of a sketchy deal, but maybe they've kind of found a place. Who knows? All right, propane gas system service area. There's actually a TREC promulgated addendum for this. If you're in an area that is serviced by one singular propane gas company, then there's an addendum you need to fill out. It's going to just be for a rural type situation. If you're in that area, you're going to get a notice, and it's just not going to apply to many folks, so I'm going to move on. The notice of water level fluctuations. This is a brand new section inside this paragraph. This is one of the paragraphs that were added whenever TREC revised the contracts. And so here's the reason why they added this. Texas passed a law that says that sellers must notify buyers if the buyer is buying a piece of property that has water, a body of water on it, whose water level fluctuates for various reasons. Maybe it's due to drought, maybe it's because somebody's using a massive amount of the water, but for whatever reason, if the water level fluctuates, then the seller must notify the buyer. That's what the law says. So TREC is smart. They went ahead and just amended the contract to disclose this notice, to give notice to every single buyer buying every single piece of property, whether it has water or not, that if they are buying a property that has water, a body of water on it, and that body of water happens to fluctuate, now you've been given notice that that's a potential risk here. And so now the law that was passed is being adhered to. The seller is hereby giving notice to the buyer because it's going to be in every single real estate contract. And so now that law is completely pointless again. Thank you, government. Thank you, laws. Thank you, TREC. And I don't know, it's kind of funny, but that's what that paragraph's all about. Paragraph 7, property condition. This paragraph is broken down into 7 different parts, and they are A, access, inspections, and utilities; B, seller's disclosure notice; C, seller's disclosure of lead-based paint; D, the acceptance of property condition; E, lender required repairs and treatments; F, completion of repairs and treatments; G, environmental matters; H, residential service contract. So let's start off with A, access, inspections, and utilities. The seller must let the buyer in the door at reasonable times. The buyer may have the property inspected. The seller must immediately turn on the utilities, and the utilities must remain on until the deal's closed. TREC amended paragraph 7A to say this: any hydrostatic testing must be separately authorized by the seller in writing. So everything else in this paragraph stays exactly the same. They just added this one thing here because what a hydrostatic testing is that's testing that's done to see if there's going to be a water leak in the plumbing system of the property. And that kind of inspection, that kind of test, I assume is a little bit more invasive than just a traditional inspection. And so it has to be authorized by the seller prior to getting that. Actually, it doesn't say prior, but it has to be authorized by the seller separately in writing in order to approve that kind of testing. Side note, if the utilities are not activated during the option period and the buyer wants to extend the option period, even though the seller might be in default here, it would still be a good idea for the buyer to pay an additional option fee if they're going to extend the option period, so that to make sure that that option period is valid. So kind of crazy. There you go. Section B, the seller's disclosure notice. We've got 3 different options here. Option 1 is that the buyer has received the notice. I'm going to skip to number 3. Number 3 is that the seller is not required to furnish the notice. And it's because of the type of seller that it might be. There are a few types that aren't required. For instance, builders are not required to give a seller's disclosure notice. A lender is not required to give a seller's disclosure if they just foreclosed on a property. If it's an estate selling a property, they're not required to give a seller's disclosure notice. I believe there's a couple other folks that aren't required. But for number 2, this is for folks where the seller did not provide the seller's disclosure notice before the contract was executed. Then they're going to allot a certain number of days that the seller has to deliver that to the buyer. It's a good idea for the buyer to fill out this in, say, maybe 3 days or so. But for the seller, it's a very bad idea to let number 2 here come into effect because of the second sentence here. This is crazy. Okay, third sentence actually. If the seller delivers the notice, the buyer may terminate this contract for any reason within 7 days after the buyer receives the notice or prior to closing, whichever occurs. And the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. That's nuts. That's almost like a second option period. So let's just say that the option period is 5 days. And let's say that the deadline to get this notice delivered from seller to buyer is on day 3. So then let's say on day 3 they deliver it. Then 7 days from that point, the buyer could back out for any reason, it says. So that could be on day, let's see, 7 plus, day, depends on how you count it, day 9 or day 10. This buyer could back out for any reason. That's kind of spooky to me. So if you're a seller, you want to make sure to cough that notice up right up front. The best thing to do if the seller's complicit on this is to get the seller's disclosure notice, the survey, and the T47 form, and just upload them to the MLS and have them as the supplemental documents. And that way, most people will get those on their own. Most agents will. But even if they don't get it on their own, if they call you and ask for it, then you can at least just say, hey, yeah, I uploaded those. They're in the supplemental section in the MLS. Go ahead and just grab it yourself. And please do me a favor and check box number 1 here on the seller's disclosure notice area. Okay, next is the seller's disclosure of lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards. If the house is built before 1978, in most circumstances, you're going to have to disclose this. And provide the disclosure, to provide the pamphlet. There are circumstances where you don't have to provide this notice, but exceptions where you don't have to deliver the lead-based paint notice are, of course, properties that are built after 1978, properties that are sold at foreclosure, properties where the living area is not separated from the sleeping area, such as like efficiency apartments, dormitory housing, or individual rooms that you're, I guess, renting out. And then the fourth exception is kind of shocking. It's housing for elderly or disabled residents where no child under the age of 6 is expected to reside. In those circumstances, you do not have to provide the lead-based paint disclosure. If you're with my company, we're probably going to try and provide that lead-based paint disclosure regardless of the circumstances, if at all possible. Section D, acceptance of property condition. Easiest way to read this is to skip down here to your 2 choices and start by reading those. So first it says that the buyer either accepts the property as is, or the buyer accepts the property as is, provide the seller at the seller's expense complete the following repairs. And you're not supposed to insert general phrases such as subject to inspections and that sort of thing. It's supposed to be specific repairs. The types of repairs that you would list here are not repairs that you would find out about in a home inspection. These would be things that you can naturally observe by walking through the house, like torn up carpet, a broken window, who knows, things like that. But people sometimes get a little nervous about checking the as-is box because they think that it might prevent them from being able to do an inspection. Well, that's where you jump right back up here towards the top. It says, as is means the present condition of the property with any and all defects and without warranty, except for the warranties, blah, 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 blah. It does not preclude the buyer from inspecting the property under paragraph 7A from negotiating repairs or treatments in a subsequent amendment or form terminating this contract during the option period. So go ahead and check box 1 if there's nothing you know that you want to negotiate up front. Do your inspection. Then if you've got some other items you want to negotiate, go for it. But that's how you attack that. Section E is lender required repairs and treatments. The interesting thing is that if the lender requires some repairs to be made, neither party is obligated to pay for those lender required repairs. And if neither party pays for the repairs, then the contract will terminate, the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer, and that's it. And then it gives a second scenario here that just, it seems like it's contradictory or redundant, but it's really not. It says if the repairs, the cost of repairs exceeds 5% of the sales price, the buyer can terminate the contract and the earnest money can be refunded to the buyer. At first glance, it's like, why would they put that second sentence in there? It seems like the first one pretty much covered it. Well, it doesn't really. What if the cost of repairs is, say, 10% of the purchase price, and the seller is willing to complete the repairs? Then it seems like, okay, well, then we don't have a problem here. Then we're going to proceed with the sale. But I can tell you, having represented buyers before in a situation like this, sometimes when the cost of repairs exceeds a certain amount, it really can freak out that buyer, and the buyer just say, no, there are too many repairs that need to be made here, and I'm not interested in pursuing a house that has had that many repairs that needed to be done. It makes me think there could be something else. So what that's saying is, even if the seller's willing to repair it, if the cost of those repairs exceeds 5%, the buyer can still back out and receive the earnest money. Section E, the completion of repairs and treatments. First of all the repairs must be made before the closing date. Secondly, if the repair involves something where a permit should be pulled, then the permit must be pulled, and licensed professionals must complete all the work. If, for instance, there is not a license governing the kind of work that is agreed upon to be done, then the professional for that industry must be the person that goes out and does the repair work. So somebody that's commercially involved in actually that industry. So let's say like a roofer. I don't know of a roofing license, but if you are getting roof work done, then it's got to be a actual roofer that's doing the repair. Let's see here. If there are warranties involved with the work that need to be transferred, then the buyer can transfer those warranties from the seller to the buyer at the buyer's expense. And let's just say if the repairs aren't done, then the seller's going to be in default of the contract. They're breaking their agreement. The buyer can either exercise their remedies that in paragraph 15, which is the default paragraph, we'll get to that here in a second, or they can extend the contract 5 days and allow a little extra time to complete the repairs. Section G, environmental matters. If there's something going on with the property or the land that's environmentally hazardous, then that could affect the buyer's ability to enjoy the property. The government could come in and wreak some havoc because you're about to get cancer or something. And so just be aware of that. If that's a concern, then there's a TREC promulgated addendum that concerns this area that you probably ought to use. And the final section, Section H, the residential service contract, otherwise known as the home warranty. It's not really a warranty. It's more like extra insurance for different components and systems inside the house. And the reason it's more like insurance is because there's a premium up front, which is going to be the amount in this blank, which the seller is going to pay for, if the amount is in that blank. And it's usually about a $400 minimum if you get the base package and the house isn't too big. There's things like square footage will increase the cost of that. You can always buy additional coverage if the home has a sprinkler system, a swimming pool, or anything else that you want them to check, maybe a septic tank. Then the cost of that home warranty is going to go up significantly. We're always going to recommend that you get a home warranty, and the reason why is because it helps prevent lawsuits. It helps everybody stay just a little bit happier. If there's something wrong with the property that you find out about after closing, then typically it's better to call somebody before you call an attorney. And so if you can call a home warranty company to hopefully fix the actual problem rather than call an attorney, that's a good thing. So we typically try and negotiate that into the contract as long as the buyer and seller are agreeable, which in most cases they are. Let's see. Sometimes you'll find that the brokers are in cahoots with these companies. Now, I can't personally recommend any company unequivocally because none of these companies have a spotless record. I mean, it's just like an insurance company. There's exceptions to the coverage, and when that happens, when that exists, people are going to get pissed if their stuff isn't covered. And the companies, they don't make money by paying out claims. They make money by not paying out claims. Now, companies also understand they have reputations to uphold, but that's just all to say that there's not one company that just completely stands out among the rest. They're kind of streaky. But there are some brokers that I guess that they earn money from these companies by recommending them because TREC has an addendum for that. And if the broker's got some kind of tight relationship with the company and maybe they're earning some money from it, then that's going to be disclosed right up front and everybody's going to sign an agreement for it. And so if you see that, that's what it is. Paragraph 8, broker's fees. The parties, meaning the buyer or the seller, if they agree to pay the brokers a fee, then those contracts are done outside of this agreement. There is no agreement between the brokers or agents and the buyer or seller in this contract. Now on page 9, there's a section where it talks about how much money the listing broker is going to pay the other broker, but that's kind of different. So Paragraph 9, the closing paragraph. This is broken up into 2 different sections. Let's talk about Section A. Section A is the date that this thing needs to be closed by. It's usually going to occur 30 to 45 days after the effective date of the contract, just because that's about how much time it takes for the lender to get all their stuff done. But it doesn't have. It can happen at any moment, as long as everybody's ready to close. That's it. But this is actually the deadline for the deal to close. So some people call it the closing date. It's actually not the closing date. It's just the closing deadline. You want to try and get it closed before this date. You don't want to aim for the date, because if you aim for it and you have a little hiccup, then you're going to end up closing afterwards, after the date. And in my mind, that's a big no-no. In the legal nutty land here, I don't know if it's that big a deal, really. I'm going to always act like it is, but time is not of the essence for this paragraph. So if the buyer was doing everything under their power to close on time, but they missed the deadline by a day or two, and this thing were to show up in court, then the judge may look at that buyer and say, well, he did everything he possibly could. Time isn't of the essence for this paragraph, so we're going to go ahead and give him the house and say he was within, the terms of the contract. Then that's just weird to me, but that's a possibility. So anyway, you just want to avoid that if at all possible. I'm never going to treat that as a relative date. If you think you're going to go beyond that date, you need to get out an amendment and extend the contract. Okay, B is those are all the things that must happen at closing. You got to deliver the property free and clear to the buyer. The buyer's got to pay their money, and so on. And we're done. Paragraph 10, possession. This is broken up into 2 different sections, the buyer's possession and leases. Let's go over buyer's possession. Okay, the buyer can either gain possession upon closing and funding or according to a temporary residential lease. If it's upon closing and funding, just realize closing and funding are 2 different actions, 2 different events. Closing could actually happen, meaning that the client could go and sign all the documents, but if it happens at, let's say, like 4 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, then funding may not happen until Monday, and I've actually had that happen before. Preparing your client for that in advance will help avoid a freak out. If the client's going to use a temporary residential lease, then first of all, the lease can't be more than 90 days. You have to use the Texas Real Estate Commission promulgated leases. And another thing is that I never recommend for my client to get involved in this. I know it helps convenience-wise, but it also exponentially increases the possibility of a complicated situation. And the reason why is because what's going to happen is one party's going to turn into the tenant and another party's going to turn into the landlord. And so here you've got a buyer and a seller that are now going to be landlord and tenant, and it may not be that big a deal to most people, but to me, it's kind of freaky because I've been a landlord before, and I know what kind of folks, what kind of situations could happen. You could have a situation where, well, here's the thing. No screening has taken place. There's been no credit check, no deposit, no background check. We don't know who your tenant is, and the same kind of horror landlord stories can happen. in one of these temporary residential leases that could happen in any other kind of lease. And so if the client isn't interested in becoming a landlord, I typically wouldn't encourage them to do this. Now, if they insist on it, I'm going to be happy to oblige, and we'll just go along with it, and I'll just make sure that they understand the situation and my concerns. I'm not going to freak them out too bad. I'm going to serve their best interest. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Now on to B, leases. Okay. After the contract is executed, the seller can't execute any additional lease. So this means that the seller can't lease out the mineral rights and collect a big signing bonus without telling anybody. They can't lease it out to a tenant. And if the property has a lease already on it, then the seller's got to tell the buyer about it, and the seller's got to give copies of the leases. And if there's an actual tenant that's involved, then they have to deliver the property condition and inventory checklist to the buyer and everything. And just a side note here, let's say that there is, back up to A, if there is a temporary residential lease that happens, and let's say that the seller's hanging out longer after closing, but the buyer just bought the house, the seller still should give keys to the house to the buyer, even though the buyer isn't allowed to go into the house. The seller now turns into the tenant. The seller has the right to occupy the property, but the buyer still is entitled to a copy of the keys. So that would make me a little weird if I was the seller, as somebody now has copies of keys to my house, and I don't know them from Adam, other than they just bought my house. Anyway, all right, moving on. Paragraph 11, special provisions. All right, this is a hot button little paragraph. If you'll notice, as the TREC contract keeps getting revised, this section keeps getting smaller and smaller, and there's a reason for that. Texas Real Estate Commission doesn't like us writing stuff in this blank, because real estate agents tend to write crazy stuff in the blanks. They want us to stick to just factual statements or statements that clarify maybe terms of the contract or different details of the contract. However, principals, the buyers or sellers, can write whatever they want in these blanks. It doesn't matter. You can write something on your own behalf, but as a realtor, I don't have any authority to write stuff here. If-then statements would be practicing law without a license. For instance, if you don't respond to the contract within a certain amount of time, then the contract becomes void or whatever. You just have to be careful about that, because if you're practicing law without a license, you could lose your real estate license. Also, if you want to say something here that there's already been a TREC promulgated addendum for, then that's absolutely prohibited. You cannot do that. So just a couple of bad ideas of things to write. Bad ideas would be personal property is conveying. That's not a good idea. For one reason, there is a personal property addendum. Secondly, it's not just factual statements. And so if you're using that addendum, just kind of a side note, a good idea is to take photos of the personal property that you want to convey when you're using one of those addendums. So that was a bad idea. A good idea of something to put in this blank would be if you've got a buyer whose name is super, super long, then you can just say, and maybe the buyer's name blank, see paragraph 11, and then here in paragraph 11 you could write out the full buyer's name. Or if the legal description was too long, maybe it had a meets and bounds legal description, or just for whatever it's too long, you could continue it here. Another acceptable section thing would be if an attorney drafts some language for you, you're more than welcome to enter it there. If you find that this little section is too small to fit everything you want, then you can always use the TREC promulgated special provisions addendum to continue all of your free writing. Paragraph 12, settlement and other expenses. This section, or this paragraph, is broken down into two main parts. You've got A, which is expenses that must be paid at or prior to closing, and then you've got B, which is a way that the contract can be terminated because of some fees. Inside A, you've got two sections. You've got one section for the seller fees, seller expenses, and then you've got another section here, number 2, is for buyer expenses. So let's dive into section A1, which is the seller expenses that are to be paid at closing. And then that is broken up into 2 parts. So you've got 12A1A. This is actually something to pay attention to because at closing, everybody's looking at the settlement statement, and there are so many fees that are paid off of each side, and sometimes many times actually, your client will ask, why is this fee on my side of the settlement statement? Well, it's because of 12A1A. Releases of liens, including prepayment penalties, which isn't all that often, but recording fees, release of seller's loan liability, tax statements, certificates, preparation of deed, 1/2 of the escrow fee, and other expenses paid by seller under the contract are in this section. That covers a lot of stuff. That's going to clear up some mystery for you there when somebody started asking why a fee is on my side. All right, B is a pretty fun little blank here. You can do a lot with this. B is for the seller to pay for an amount not to exceed blank to be applied in the following order. I'm just going to read this because I have to. The buyer's expenses, which buyers prohibited from paying through FHA and VA, or the Texas Veteran Lands Board, or other governmental loans, and then whatever money's put in that blank, after all that's taken care of, then it's applied to buyer's expenses as allowed by lender. That's a really broad statement there on that second half. You can cover a whole lot of stuff. Anything that the lender allows, you can be covered out of this, and the lender allow more than you might imagine. So couple notes here. First of all, the numbers in this blank, they tend to be quite large, into the several $1,000 range, and so you just want to make sure that you're not going to exceed the lender's loan limitations. FHA allows for up to 6% of the purchase price to be included in this blank. So what that is 6% of the buyer's closing cost to be paid for by the seller. So you also have to realize, if you're adding money to the seller's side of the settlement statement, then that's just however much money you add to the seller's side, that's that much money that seller is going to lose or not make. It's going to reduce the seller's net. So if you're a buyer, you're making an offer, putting money in this blank, you might want to consider increasing your offer amount to compensate for whatever money you're putting in that blank. If you're the seller, then you want to make sure that you flip to this page here, and page 5, to make sure that you see how much money is in that blank, so that you just automatically subtract that from the total purchase price, which a good realtor will do right off the bat. We're not going to be fooling anybody by putting any money in this blank. Everybody just makes their decision based on what the net of the proceeds are, but still it could be an oversight if you don't watch out. One thing that I like to do is I like to, if I can at all, and I'm representing the buyer, I like to not put any money in this blank and do my best on purchase price, because that's where a lot of negotiation is going to come from. And then that way, if I am using some financing that allows for seller paid closing costs, then I'll go ahead and proceed into the deal, get into the option period, do my inspection, find out what repairs need to be negotiated. Then if I've got some repairs that I get the seller to agree to pay for, then I may, instead of actually getting money for those repairs, or maybe it's just some upgrades that I want done to the house, all I really need is the money so that I can do those myself. So what I would do is, if I was the buyer, what I would do is I would ask the seller to give me X amount of dollars, providing it fits within my lender's loan parameters, and ask for it in this blank. And so by not putting anything in this blank ahead of time, it gives you that room to add the money later on, amend the contract, and either negotiate repairs or upgrades and include it in this blank. Because if you start trying to negotiate repairs, like specific itemized repairs, then it could cause questions, and the lender might take something that's really pretty harmless repair item and cause want to investigate it further and get additional inspections, and cause the contract to kind of wobble a little bit and fall into jeopardy of falling apart, whatever. Okay. I know it says it right here, but I just have to repeat. if your buyer is using FHA or VA, count on something being in that blank, because there are expenses that they're going to have that they just can't pay. So don't look at it as all that bad. It's just a fact of life if they're using that kind of financing. All right, now let's go on down to 2. It says buyer's expenses. Again, I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but it just goes through a lot of really helpful things to know when your buyer is sitting there looking at the settlement statement and they see that itemized list of charges, and they're going to ask, why is there a final compliance inspection fee on my side, or why is there a wire transfer fee on my side? Why isn't the seller paying for that? Well, it's because it lists it right here in this section. All right, moving down to B. This is kind of interesting. If there's an expense that has been agreed upon in the terms of this contract, and the expense ends up being much greater than what everybody thought it was going to be, then this is saying that the party can get out of the contract. The contract can be terminated if expenses end up being more than what they expected. Chapter 13, Prorations. This is just the only fair way to do it. This is saying that whatever expenses there are, they're just going to be paid by the party that incurred the expenses. So property taxes is the biggest sticking point here. There's only going to be one property tax bill sent per year, and it's sent at the end of the year. So the new owner is going to get stuck with the entire property tax bill for the entire year. However, the new owner will have only lived there for a portion of the year. So the way that the title company makes sure that the new owner isn't having to foot the entire bill is for the entire year is by collecting an estimated amount of what they think the property taxes are going to be at the end of the year. They collect that prorated amount, estimated prorated amount from January 1st through the day of closing, and they get that amount from the seller, and the seller pays that to the buyer. That way at the end of the year, the buyer's got that money in their possession, then they go ahead and just pay the entire tax bill. There's something here that I haven't ever personally encountered, but that is this proration amount is based off of an estimation of what they think the taxes are going to be. Well, if the taxes change drastically, then that might mean that the amount that they collected from the seller up front was either drastically higher or drastically reduced from what it should have been. And so this paragraph says that they'll actually, I guess, come back together and adjust whatever amount it should have been and either collect money or give money to the appropriate party well after closing. That's what I interpret this to be. It's kind of freaky. Chapter 14. If the property is burned down or damaged by flood or something, then they can either terminate the contract, or buyer could extend the time to allow the seller to fix up the house, or the buyer could accept the property in its as-is condition and accept remedies some other way. Finally, paragraph 15, the default paragraph. This is the paragraph that you need to become familiar with, because if anybody is not upholding their obligations and agreements in this contract, then they're going to be in default of the contract, and this is where you're going to come to read what kind of remedies are available for the defaulted situation. So let's say if the buyer fails to comply with the contract, the buyer will be in default, and the seller can enforce specific performance and seek such other relief as may be provided by law, or both. Or they could terminate this contract to receive earnest money as liquidated damages, thereby releasing both parties from the contract. If the seller fails to comply with this contract, the seller will be in default, and the buyer may either enforce specific performance, seek other such relief provided by law, or both, or terminate this contract and receive the earnest money, thereby releasing both parties from the contract. So you see, each party has the same exact options on how to remedy if the other one defaults. But it's really not very equal, because the specific performance thing I think would be a little harder to enforce on a buyer. I've seen a bunch of attorneys recommend that the seller always scratch out the specific performance clause here, and leaving only, I guess, other relief provided by law and possibly the termination option here to get the earnest money back. But the interesting thing to me is if the contract is terminated and somebody gets a hold of that earnest money, then that ends it, according to this. That says that releases everybody and the deal is done. So, paragraph 16, mediation. I love this little paragraph, even though I think it's kind of silly. It's just saying that if there's some kind of conflict that arises as a result of this contract, then everybody's agreeing to go to mediation. However, it also says down here that this paragraph does not preclude a party from seeking equitable relief from a court of competent jurisdiction. So basically, it's just hopefully setting the expectation in everybody's mind that we're going to go to mediation and not go to court and try and obliterate each other. We'll try and actually solve the problem instead of just fighting all that much. But if we really just wanted to fight, then we could ignore that paragraph altogether and just go fight and go to court. So there you go. And if we do go to court, let's talk about paragraph 17. You got attorney's fees. Basically, it's just saying whoever wins is entitled to recover reasonable attorney fees. Paragraph 18, escrow. This paragraph is broken up into 5 different sections. You have A, escrow, B, expenses, C, demand, D, damages, and E, notices. A just says the escrow agent is not going to be held liable for anything, even if they lose the earnest money, as long as they can blame the earnest money being lost on the bank that they deposited the earnest money with. And B is talking about the expenses. The earnest money that the escrow agent is holding is going to first go to the down payment of the buyer and then any expenses that are incurred by the buyer. If the closing doesn't occur, then they're going to use that earnest money to pay any kind of expenses that have been incurred. If there aren't any expenses, then they're going to give that earnest money to the buyer. And if there's not enough earnest money to cover the expenses, then the title company is going to demand all the expenses for the deal be paid. So expenses would be things such as the survey, and that would be fairly common to happen if the deal falls apart late in the game. But there'd probably be enough earnest money to cover the survey amount. C, demand. This is a fun little paragraph, and this is something that you hope you don't have to encounter, but if you just close enough deals, I guarantee you will encounter it at some point or another. So let's just say that the deal falls apart and because somebody's in default, they didn't uphold their obligation. Well, in that situation, a lot of times there's going to be a dispute as to who the earnest money is owed to. Well, the title company's unbiased third party. They got no reason to favor one side or the other. So the title company is going to ask for a release to be signed by everybody. Well, if somebody doesn't sign that release, then what can happen is any party in the transaction can actually send a demand letter to the title company demanding for that earnest money to be released. What's going to happen is title company is going to let everybody in the deal know that a demand was made for the earnest money. If nobody responds to that demand, then whoever made the demand gets the earnest money. If somebody responds to the demand, then I'm really not sure what happens. But it just gets drug out and it kind of gets nasty. But here's what happens. D, damages. Paragraph D is a fun one. Damages. If you got to get into paragraph D and figure out exactly what this thing says, then you're in the middle of a hairy deal. And because what this is involving is if somebody that's in the deal wants to get out of the deal, what they have to do is they have to get everybody in the transaction to sign a release that releases that person out of the deal. And that's all fine and good, but it can kind of be a trick. You can imagine if somebody's bailing out on a deal that somebody else in that transaction, the odds are they may not be too happy about the fact somebody's bailing out. Now, here's the problem with somebody getting too unhappy is if one person wants to bail out of the deal and they have the right to bail out, then they send that release out to everybody else in the deal. If another party in that transaction doesn't sign that release, but then later it's found out that they actually should have signed that release, then if that goes to court, then the person that should have signed that release is going to be in big trouble. And this paragraph spells out what kind of damages they can get for not signing that kind of release within 7 days. It says that whatever damages there are, whatever earnest money there was, all the attorney's fees and the cost of the suit, all has to be paid by the person that wrongfully fails to or refuses to sign the release. Okay, that's it. Now, paragraph E talks about notices. All of the notices that must be delivered to the buyer or the seller are not going to be considered sent unless they're sent to the person that's outlined in paragraph 21 below here. So whatever contact information is in paragraph 21, that's the contact information that's going to be used by the escrow officer, the title company, to send all the notices involved in the deal. And when the title company sends those to that contact information, that's when the notice is going to be considered sent. So it's important, which I'm going to cover here in a minute. It's important to make sure you have good contact information in paragraph 21. Paragraph 19, representations. This is just saying that if the seller represents the property or something being a certain way, that even after closing, they can be held liable for whatever they said. Those representations survive past closing. And then also says that the seller may continue to show the property and receive and negotiate backup offers. So if your buyer's under contract and they just see people coming in and out all day long, that's perfectly well within the seller's right to keep showing that property. Paragraph 20, federal tax requirements. If the seller is a foreign person, then the title company may withhold some proceeds from the sale to make sure that all the taxes that need to be paid are going to get paid. Paragraph 21. We've heard so much about you. Here we are. All right, notices. All notices from one party to another must be in writing and are effective when mailed to, hand-delivered, or transmitted by a facsimile or electronic transmission to these following locations. If it's blank, then let's get that sucker filled out, whatever it takes. Let's get it filled out. If it's blank and I'm not able to get the other party to do it, I'm probably just going to fill in the other party's information as best I can. If they don't agree to it, then they need to put a line through it and change it. But I'm going to want to make sure some kind of contact information is in those blanks. And it's not a good idea to just put the agent's information in the blank, especially if you're that agent. The reason why is because if you go on vacation or something and even long after the deal's over, there are a couple notices in here that is still may be delivered depending on a circumstance or two that could happen. But anyway, if your contact information is the only information in there, then it's going to cause some kind of delay between the time you get it and the time you relay it to the client. And that delay could cause a problem that you probably don't want to and shouldn't be held responsible for. So always put the client's information in there. Perfectly acceptable to say, copy me, copy the agent on this correspondence here. Just a few more mentions here. Time is of the essence in almost all of the TREC contracts notice provisions, and some of the notices require time-sensitive action by the party receiving the notice. For example, the seller's notice to the buyer of the acceptance of another contract under the Addendum for sale of another property by the buyer remains, which is a contingency contract, requires action by the buyer. And if the notice was sent to the party's agent, then the agent would need to relay that information to his or her client. The additional step could cause a delay that might result in the client losing a time-sensitive reply option or right. And also, the word notices in this paragraph, it has a contractual meaning. Giving notice to a party can affect the party's rights and obligations in several parts of the contract, such as, say, paragraph 23, the termination option, and the third-party financing addendum. And therefore, care needs to be given and taken to provide methods of notice that don't cause needless delay. Some agents are reluctant to put the buyers or the seller's contact information in paragraph 21 because they think that direct contact with the other party is forbidden. However, as long as you're using the contact information to provide notice to the other party, you're not really crossing a boundary of soliciting another agent's client or doing anything that's going to jeopardize the contract. Paragraph 22, agreements of parties. Some agents actually start filling out their contract by turning directly to this section first and marking off all the boxes. That way they just don't forget, and it's just kind of a reminder to help jog their memory of possibly an additional addendum that needs to be included that they weren't considering before. So that's a pretty good idea. So here you're just checking off the boxes of all the other addendums that are going to accompany this contract. If you had an addendum that wasn't listed here, such as sale of personal property or whatever, then you would check off the other box and list it in that blank. One thing that you would not put in here is the information about brokerage services form. That's not an addendum. That's just a disclosure. It's not a part of any kind of agreement. So anyway, that's it. All right, the termination option paragraph. This paragraph allows the buyer to be able to get out of the contract within a certain amount of time for a small amount of money. There are a lot of little ins and outs hidden, buried in this paragraph, so I'm just going to kind of tiptoe through it and go through it one step at a time. For nominal consideration, that means for a small amount of money, the receipt of which is hereby acknowledged by seller, means that the receipt of the money is actually acknowledged by the seller. It's actually attached to this contract. The receipt is attached to this contract. I'll show you here in a minute. It's on page 9. And the buyer's agreement to pay seller blank amount of money as the option fee. The amount of money here, it's a nominal fee, so it really runs the gamut. The more the purchase price, the more money I would expect to see in this blank personally, especially if I was the seller. So just kind of a rule of thumb that I've come up with. There's really no rhyme or reason for this. I've just kind of noticed where people gravitate to. And the number in this blank tends to be about 1/10 of 1% of the purchase price. And the way the math looks like on that is let's say there's a $250,000 house. You do $250,000 times 0.001, and that equals $250. So that'll put you in the ballpark. It's, give or take. You can put $25 you can put $5 in that blank, or you can put as much as you want. But it is designed to be a nominal fee. So anyway, moving on. Buyer's agreement to pay seller X amount of money as the option fee within 3 days after the effective date of this contract. Okay, so this is kind of the beginning of where some confusion could come in. Within 3 days after the effective date of this contract. So the effective date of this contract is going to be the date that you put in this blank. See there? Effective date. Okay. And it says 3 days after the effective date. So by my math, that means if the effective date is the 5th, I'm going to count that to be 1 would be the 6th, 2 would be the 7th, 3 would be the 8th. But it doesn't specify an actual time. And I've actually talked to an attorney about this, and it hasn't really been defined by the court as to what time is reasonable or mandatory or whatever. And it's not defined in the contract here. So the way I interpret that is I actually would count that as midnight at the end of the 3rd day. So in this case, it would be midnight of the 8th. To avoid this whole problem, we tend to actually specify an hour that it ends, since this paragraph carries so much weight. I don't want any ambiguity as to when this thing ends. So in the special provisions, I might further specify an hour that it ends. Of course, talk to an attorney as to what kind of specific language you would need to use to do that, but that really clears it up. And that also, let's say if you put that the hour of the termination option period ends at 4 p.m. on the last day of the option period, then that prevents you from a situation where you might end up trying to negotiate some repair items or something at 11 p.m. on the night that this thing terminates. So there you go. That's how I count the days. Okay, so the seller grants the buyer the unrestricted right to terminate this contract by giving notice of termination. So the seller can't back out, but the buyer can. And the buyer has to give notice of the termination within a certain number of days, and you can put any number of days in that blank that you want to put. However, I say that anything less than 5 days is really probably not realistic, because you have to assume that in most cases there's going to be at least 1 day of a weekend involved in that time period. And I want to make sure that we've got enough time to verify that the utilities are on, coordinate schedules with an inspector, because that's usually what's going to be done during the option period, get the results of the inspection back, draft the repair amendment if some repairs need to be negotiated, or if the buyer wants the seller to address some repair items, then they'll need to draft that repair amendment and then send that over to the seller. And then you want to make sure that you're giving it to them in enough time prior to the deadline of this option period to give them time to respond, so that you don't end up in a situation where the buyer's waiting to hear back from the seller on the repair amendment that they just sent in, and kind of watching the clock and wondering if the seller's going to respond. And if that seller doesn't respond, the buyer freaking out and thinking that they've got to send in a termination of the contract because they don't get anything in response, because you're trying to negotiate this thing at 11 o'clock p.m. on the night of the last day of the option period. So anyway, 5 days would be the minimum for me. Anything longer than 10 days gets to be a little ridiculous for me. A lot of sellers will start to ask questions as to why they're asking for more than 10 days. 10 days is really about the max that you're going to want to see. 14 days, absolutely. Anything longer than that, and I'm going to want a pretty decent explanation. After the effective date of this contract, which would be called the option period. So we're calling this period, whatever period is outlined in this number of days, we're calling that the option period. If no dollar amount is stated in the option fee, or if the buyer fails to pay the option fee to the seller within the time prescribed, this paragraph will not be a part of this contract, and the buyer shall not have the unrestricted right to terminate this contract. So that tells me this has got to be at least $1, and the option fee must be delivered to the seller within the time prescribed. So when is the time prescribed? The time prescribed is 3 days. Okay? So this money has got to get to the seller within 3 days. Or actually what's got to happen is the receipt has to be signed within 3 days. And I've talked to an attorney on that. They're kind of gotten down to the nitty-gritty on who's allowed to sign that receipt and when is it actually received. Here it says it must be received by the buyer or by the seller, but really you're probably handing it to the seller's broker. Anyway, just get that receipt signed and you're good to go. This paragraph will not be part of the contract, will not have the unrestricted right to terminate. If buyer gives notice of termination within the time prescribed, which would be the time period in this blank, the option fee will not be refunded. So whatever amount is in this blank, you can just guarantee your buyer that they are not going to get that money back if they back out for any reason. That money's gone. The only way they'll get that back is if they check the right box on the next line. So the option fee will not be refunded. However, any earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. And that's kind of the whole goal of this paragraph, is to allow your buyer the opportunity to back out of the contract and get their earnest money back, because the earnest money is not a nominal amount of money. It's probably going to be a pretty decent amount of money, maybe on a $250,000 house, maybe $2,500 or so. The option fee will or will not be credited to the sales price at closing. I have never seen a seller throw too much of a fit on which one of these boxes is checked, so I always check that the option fee will be credited to the credited at closing. Time is of the essence for this paragraph, and strict compliance with the time for performance is required. This is interesting to me, and this is kind of an eye-opening phrase here. That time is of the essence for this paragraph, and strict compliance with the time for performance is required. It's crazy to me that time is not of the essence for the entire contract. What that means is that if you are an hour late, a minute late, shoot, a second late on any of these deadlines, then you can be held accountable for not obeying the terms of this, of the time prescribed here, and what you've got to do during the time prescribed. And so then if you don't do what's required during that time, then this paragraph won't be in effect. For most of the rest of the contract, time is not of the essence. So what does that mean? Are those deadlines in the rest of the contract just kind of relative? Maybe. I don't know. I guess it kind of depends on the excuse. Really, it just depends on what the buyer and seller are agreeing to. And just if everybody's kind of heading in the same direction, everybody still wants to buy and sell the house, then go through with the transaction, then whatever other timelines are in the rest of the contract is probably not going to be that big a deal. Okay, so what happens if the buyer or the buyer's agent delivers this option fee outside of that 3-day period? Well, I'm not exactly sure what happens if that seller accepts that money. It may be construed as a renegotiation of terms, or if you just read the language here in the contract, it could be construed as it doesn't matter if they accepted it after that 3-day period, then this paragraph is not in effect. I would just say if I'm on the seller side, or I'm maybe part of the admin staff on the seller side, I am not accepting any money after that 3-day period unless I've talked with my client and made sure that they're okay with it. And still, even at that, I'm going to feel a little uneasy about it because I'm going to be going directly against what it says here. This paragraph is something that's so important that as soon as you get an executed contract, you've got to be preparing your client for getting that option fee. You've got to be driving it to their office. This is not a situation where it's okay to, if you're representing the buyer, to take that option fee and deliver it to the title company. That does not cut it here. The only time that you let go of that option fee is if the person that has the authority to sign the receipt page, let's go ahead and take a look at it now, is standing right in front of you. They've got a pen in hand and they're ready to sign this thing. And so here is the option fee receipt. Let's just look at this thing. Receipt of blank amount of money, which is the option fee, that nominal fee, in the form of blank, meaning don't accept cash, just just as the normal protocol of doing business, just don't accept cash in a real estate deal. Take cashier check, money order, personal check if you want to. Just keep in mind that it may not clear within a couple of days, especially if you're getting it on a weekend, but whatever, in the form of a check or whatever is acknowledged. And then here it says the seller or the listing broker can sign. It's kind of interesting because this paragraph has so much specific language that it makes me wonder, or it made me wonder, if the listing agent was allowed to sign. Well, the agent acts on behalf of the listing broker, so I'm perfectly comfortable in my office for an agent to sign for this, but the seller is definitely also authorized to sign this. And in my office, actually, if you run it up to the receptionist, she's going to know whether or not she has the authority to sign on this. And in our office, everybody's got a license, so it works out. But in your office, you may want to just kind of have a little meeting about who's allowed to sign this and when. If you're representing the seller and the buyer's agent shows up on day 4 with this check, you might want to make sure that your receptionist knows not to sign this thing if it's outside of that time period. So that's going to require an extra level of communication inside your office there. So that's it. That's the optionation, the option fee and option paragraph. The receipt page, if the buyer gives a certain amount of money, delivers it within 3 days, gets the receipt signed, and they back out within whatever amount of days they enter here. If they decide they want to back out during that amount of time or during that time period, then they can absolutely back out, and they just don't even have to have a good reason. They can back out just because they feel like it. As long as they're okay losing that money and not pursuing the deal, then that's it. So let's move on. Woo! That paragraph 23 was a beast to record. So I've got to change just one thing, because TREC came back to this paragraph and said, you know what, some of the problems that people were noticing is a problem that they wanted to do something about. So when they changed the contract in November 2015, they added a line that said, if the buyer wants to back out within the option period, then the buyer has to back out by 5 o'clock on the day that the option period ends. And this prevents a situation where the buyer tries to give notice at like 11:45 p.m. and causes a big problem for everybody. So they just put this in the hard language of the contract. Says option period ends at 5 o'clock, and it's not just anybody's 5 o'clock. It's the 5 o'clock in the time zone that the property's in. So if the buyer or seller are on the East Coast, West Coast, that doesn't matter. If the house is in Central Time Zone, then it's 5 o'clock Central Time. There you go. So everything else I said about paragraph 23 is correct. That's the only change that happened whenever they went in and revised those contracts. Paragraph 24, consult an attorney before signing. The contract here reminds you that TREC prohibits real estate licensees from giving legal advice. I would take it a step further and say, just don't get any legal advice from anybody except for a licensed attorney, not just a realtor. And then it reminds you to read this contract carefully. So here's what you need to do. You need to read the entire contract so that you can get to paragraph 24 and read the sentence that tells you to read the contract carefully so that you can know to read the contract carefully. It's kind of funny. Anyway, moving on. If there is an attorney involved in the deal, you want to list the attorney's information in these blanks. I would include them on all the correspondence, carbon copy them on the emails, and then just realize that the attorney is probably going to have more authority in the transaction than a realtor would, and the attorney can do anything that a realtor would do in the contract. You want to talk to your broker about how the commissions might be split up. If the attorney wants a piece of the commissions, then they're certainly entitled to it, but there could be some extra rules or circumstances that would come into play that you want to just deal with on a case-by-case scenario. Now, one thing about the intimidation factor of an attorney, just because they're an attorney doesn't mean they're some kind of big, bad, crazy dude that has more authority than God or something. I mean, they can't do anything more than what the client could do for themselves. Really, the attorneys just has the authority to act on behalf of their client. So if the attorney's involved in the deal and they're inserting crazy clauses into the special provisions or attaching additional addendums or whatever, or telling you what to do, just kind of tap the brakes for a second and sure, give that attorney plenty of respect, but you don't have to just lay over and let the attorney rule the roost here. You've still got to look out for your client's best interest, and you got to make sure that things are heading in the right direction for the transaction. So I think it's always a good idea just to include your broker, make sure your broker knows when there's an attorney involved, because there are going to be some extra dynamics involved in the transaction that you're not going to be accustomed to dealing with, because the funny thing is that attorneys are generally not involved in the transactions under, say, the $600,000 mark or so. And it's still just not very common for attorneys to get involved in these residential real estate transactions for some reason. I'm not sure why, but anyway, there you go, moving on. Okay, let's look at the box right above the signature lines there. The one that says executed the blank day of blank, the effective date. The one that says broker, fill in the date of final acceptance. So for some reason, this box is overlooked quite a bit. People just forget and neglect to put the date in there, but that's a big mistake. Now, the contract can actually be a valid contract. If everybody signs it, then it's legit and it's done. But without the date in there, you're just setting yourself up for inevitable confusion and a possibly a conflict, because nobody's going to know what date to begin all the timelines from and what kind of counting to begin. When certain things come into effect and when certain deadlines end, and that sort of thing. So it's absolutely important to fill in the date of this contract. Now, we've got to talk about, when is a contract actually executed? It's not as simple as you would think. Let's just run through a scenario. Let's say the buyer initials everything, signs the offer, sends it over to the seller. Seller decides they don't like it exactly the way it's written, so they strike through one or two things, initial those changes, initial every page of the contract, sign the contract. So now they send it back over to the buyer. So now the buyer's got a completely signed and initialed contract except for one change, basically. And all they've got to do is initial that one change, and then they think they have a deal, which they might, but it isn't over yet. So let's say that buyer now initials the change. Now, how's that seller supposed to know that they have a deal? The seller hasn't seen the contract. The seller doesn't know. So it's not actually a done deal until that seller finds out that the deal has been accepted. So the buyer can't really execute the contract. They should send it back over to the seller, then the seller execute the contract. Now, I'll tell you that in practice, that's just not very practical. So the way that we handle it in our office is we just want to make sure that everybody understands that the contract is final, it's all agreed upon, and it's executed. And so let's say in that situation, if I was representing the buyer's agent, I would get my client to initial that one last change. Then I would just pick up the phone and call the other agent and just say, hey, we just accepted your contract. Do you mind if I put the executed date here on the contract and then go ahead and send it over to the title company? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say yes. So that solves any kind of issue that you're going to have. If they say yes, then you're good to go. And that's how you execute a contract. Now, just below the executed box, you'll see where the buyer and seller sign. This seems pretty self-explanatory. Your client needs to sign the contract. There are going to be circumstances where this isn't quite as clear-cut. For instance, when we're going over the contracts in a contract training, everybody wants to pretend that everybody's going to toe the line on everything that's right and wrong, and that's primary objective. But in the transaction, the objective is serving your client's best interest and reaching an agreement. So if one party or the other isn't available to sign, then sometimes the question will come about, well, who really has the authority to sign this contract? If you got a husband and wife and the husband can't be there, can the wife sign for the husband? I'm just not going to touch that in this contract training. This is kind of a basic contract training, but that topic needs to be addressed, and how the signature needs to appear, whether it's the same kind of signature that's on the loan documents or that's on the driver's license. And let's say if it's a power of attorney or a company, how to actually sign the contract, it may make a difference. So just realize the situation that you're in, get specific advice for your situation, and make sure that the blanks are signed, and we'll leave it at that.
And that's it. That's all 8 pages of the contract. That's actually the entirety of the agreement between the buyer and the seller. Now let's move to page 9. And 9 is kind of unique. There's actually been some conversation as to whether page 9 should even be included in the contract. And I think it's a good idea that it is, although it doesn't really contain any kind of agreement between buyer and seller. What it does is it just makes sure that all the pertinent information is in one spot. So here's page 9. What we have here is the area for each real estate agent's firm to put their information. Other broker firm would be the buyer agent and his company or her company, their license number, and you would just select the appropriate box here. Sub-agent would be somebody that is still on the seller's side of the transaction, but they're just involved to help facilitate the transaction. I don't think I've ever been a part of a transaction where there was an actual sub-agent. I think that happened more in the before the year 2000. Must have, because that's when I got into real estate. It was early 2000. So anyway, whatever. Moving on, you've got the company names here. Name of associate's licensed supervisor. That's kind of a new blank. If the supervisor is different from the broker, then you would put that there. The listing agent's name, listing broker's address, listing the email address, associate's name. If you'll notice here, there's not a signature line for either agent. That's not required anymore. Okay, and in this blank is...
Now we've got where the listing broker has agreed to pay the other broker blank of the total price when the listing broker's fee is received. Okay, and then it authorizes the escrow agent to pay as directed. Now, since neither broker or agent's signature is on this contract, I'm kind of questioning as to whether or not this is the actual place where the agreement is made on how much one party is supposed to pay the other, or if it's whatever's disclosed in the MLS. I'm really not quite sure, but since there aren't any broker signatures on this, the question comes up. I would still just make sure that this is accurate, okay? One other thing is, if there's a bonus involved or some other form of compensation, then it's commission. Any compensation earned in the deal by a broker or agent is going to be considered commission. I don't care really what form it takes. That's what it is. And so you'll just want to make sure you put that in the blank. And my gosh, if it's a cruise or something, sometimes there are a flat screen TV. There are some situations where things that have monetary value, but they're not necessarily just money, are involved. Then you would want to just kind of probably address where those things should be documented at. That it needs to be disclosed at closing. I'm not sure if this is the appropriate blank or not. Just handle that specific, unique circumstance with the direction of your broker. If it is just cold hard cash and it's a bonus, go ahead and add it in and put the total amount of the commission in this blank if at all possible.
And then here are the two receipts. So you have the option fee receipt. We've already gone over that. That needs to be completed, and that option fee is not going to be considered as received until that receipt is filled out. Then also you've got the contract and earnest money receipt. This is a receipt for the earnest money. I always make sure that the title company actually fills this out. I wouldn't have anybody else fill this out. And if I'm the buyer's agent, I am not going to just give my earnest money to the listing agent. It doesn't belong in the listing agent's hands. They're not an unbiased third party. It belongs in the escrow agent's hands. So I know I've had many times where the listing agent says, hey, we're bosom buddies with the title company. We'll go ahead and deliver that for you. We're going over there here in just a little while. I always just say, oh, thank you, but I've already had it going that way, or I was going to go by the office there anyway, so no big deal. I'll go ahead and just drop it off. And I haven't had them refuse that too many times. If so, I'm persistent. I say, oh no, it's really okay. I don't mind. I'm going to go ahead and drop it off. Always want to make sure if you're on the buyer side of the transaction, you're the one dropping that off. And the same thing goes for the option fee as it goes for this earnest money fee. I don't let loose of that earnest money check unless I've got somebody in front of me at the title company with a pen in hand ready to sign this thing. And if it doesn't happen like that, there's a chance that it won't happen. And then we're really up a creek. I'm not serving my client well in that instance. So there you have it. That's all 9 pages of the contract.